Hi, my name is John Griffin. I'll be going over Chapter 1, Prophecy. First, we are going to discuss the trading activities prior to September 11th. The author of the book, James Rickards, asked John Muellerin if there was any suspicious activity that happened prior to 9/11. John's response was, "It was the most blatant case of insider trading I've ever seen." Generally speaking, bets that stocks are going to rise versus bets that stocks are going to fall, there is a 1-to-1 ratio. But on September 6th and 7th, there was a 12-to-1 ratio that United Airlines stock would fall. And on September 10th, the options bets ratio was 6-to-1 that American Airlines stock would fall. Now I want to discuss how to make money by betting on a falling stock. First, I'm going to talk about put options. Put options, in a way, are like an insurance policy. You could have a share of stock that's worth $100, and you have a feeling that over the next 6 months it's going to drop drastically to $20. So you can buy an option for $5 that would give you the right to sell your one stock for $95 at some point within those 6 months. But you're not obligated to exercise the option. So you can buy the option for $5. If the stock drops below $95, you should exercise the right. Or if it goes up and your stock is worth $120, you would just let the option expire and it would be worthless. But it was just like an insurance policy. What took me a while to understand was that you do not have to own the stock to buy stock options. If you think a stock is going to fall, you can go ahead and buy options to sell, just the same example, to sell the stock at $100, but you think that stock in the next 6 months is going to drop to $20. So you buy the option for $5 to sell a stock you don't own yet for $100. Once the stock falls to $20, you purchase it for $20 and then you immediately exercise your option to sell that stock for $100 and you just netted $75, $80 from the stock and minus $5 for the put option price. Next, I'm going to talk about selling short. This is where you can borrow a stock that you think will fall in price. So if you think in 6 months the price of the stock will be $20, then you borrow a share of stock that's worth $100 and you immediately sell that stock. You get the $100 in cash, and then in 6 months, when the stock is $20, you buy it and then give that stock back. And you get to keep the difference, $80. This is a lot more risky than an option because if the stock goes up, which it could go up to $500, it can go up to infinity, so you have much higher risk in selling short. That is a lot higher risk to sell short than in purchasing put options when betting on a falling stock. The pre-9/11 trading that occurred may have been started by terrorists, but a majority of those bets that the stock would fall were legitimate because people see these trades happening, so they think that Those people must know something that I don't, so they hop on the bandwagon. And this is what happens in a lot of insider trading deals. What actually makes it illegal for insider trading? Generally, when it's an insider, uh, it's a manager or other employees who would be considered insiders. They use information that they have that is not public information, and they use that information to profit. The example the book gives is Martha Stewart selling some of her I'm Clone Systems shares, uh, but interestingly, she wasn't convicted of insider trading. She was convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements in connection with her trade of I'm Clone. The 9/11 Commission report seems to have missed some of this terrorist trading. They did note that there was highly suspicious trades, but they gave these explanations for them. 95% of the options purchased on September 6th was by non-Al-Qaeda related company, but that doesn't take into consideration the amplification. Like I mentioned before, the terrorists made these option purchases, and then people see what's going on and they think those people, not knowing they're terrorists, must know something I don't know, so they jump on the wagon and purchase the same options. And several companies traced it back to a newsletter that recommended this type of trade. But there's actually thousands of these types of recommendations that say buy or sell on any specific investment. So this publication may say buy, this publication may say sell. So it's a weak explanation. The CIA created a team to analyze pre-terrorism market trading. So generally speaking, people bet the same amount on that a stock will rise, that a stock will fall, a 1-to-1 ratio. This system being developed tried to see when that ratio was off. So when a stock was going to fall and they bought a bunch of options and there's a say 10-to-1 ratio that the stock is going to fall, is that a predictor for a terrorist attack? They started running this in 2006, and it seemed to work pretty well. They regularly picked up presumed insider trading, but the CIA is not a law enforcement agency, so they would just give that information over to the proper authorities for them to take action or not take action. On August 7th, 2006, the system picked up a big signal for American Airlines, and 3 days later, New Scotland Yard foiled a terrorist plot to blow up airplanes. So it seems like this was a good system and it could, in fact, predict terrorist attacks. Then, sometime later, the team met with the CIA and the CIA's legal counsel. The CIA and the legal team didn't like what they were doing, but the team said that it was all public information and agreed with the CIA that they were not law enforcement, but there was a concern about public opinion that they didn't want the government to seem like Big Brother and that they were spying on people. So ultimately, the project was shelved, even though it worked fairly well. I think ethical business leaders can learn that you shouldn't just jump on the bandwagon when you see something happening. If it was me and I bought these options and then 9/11 happened, I would feel really horrible. That would be a horrible thing to do. And even if there's no terrorist attack associated with it, it is just insider trading. That still does hurt some shareholders and can be very bad. Another thing to learn is when you develop projects like they created Project Prophecy. If it's a good tool, you should use it and not shelve it. Uh, Even though companies may not have all the political red tape that the federal government does, there still can be office politics and good ideas can get shelved. So they should learn to utilize the tools they've developed.
This is Chapter 2, The War God's Face. I'm Sean Rogers. I'll be narrating this portion. The second chapter of the book, Rickard talks about what the new face of war is. Let me start with a precursor here and say that I'm someone that served in the Marine Corps, and as such, I know a little bit about war. I've been to a war zone. I've read strategy books concerning war, Sun Tzu, Clausen, the classics. As such, I'm familiar with war, but what Rickard talks about in his informational warfare is a lot different than the conventional warfare that I've studied. And Rickard doesn't really give a strong definition, a clear definition of what he means when he's talking about informational warfare. So I've taken more on myself to present what I believe he means, and I've broken it down to economical warfare, financial warfare, currency warfare, and technology warfare. First aspect of informational warfare that I'm going to talk about is economic warfare. Now, economic and financial warfare are terms used interchangeably, but I'm going to make the distinction here and state that economic warfare has always been an aspect of war. Sun Tzu talks about the skillful leader subdues the enemy's troops without any fighting. Now, part of what he's talking about is negotiations, but he's also talking about being able to cut off logistics, to cut off the supplies to the enemy, to starve them out, starve them of their food and of their supplies and of their weaponry. So economic warfare has always had an aspect of war. Napoleon said that troops travel on their stomach. So if we take away their food, we take away their ability to fight. The difference between financial warfare and economic warfare that I'm going to make the distinction of is the idea that financial warfare, according to Rickard, is more about wealth destruction. So it's less about blockades, less about cutting off supply lines, less about the soldiers, more about the citizens. We're talking about destroying the markets, destroying the asset values of countries and the citizens, and talking about destroying the standard of living of the people within those nations. And that's what Rickard is talking about when he talks about wealth destruction and financial warfare. Orwell sums it up kind of nicely in his novel 1984. The primary aim of modern warfare is to use up the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. And that's the gist of what financial warfare is about. Here we look at some of the offensive and defensive aspects that Rickard points out of financial warfare. On the offense, malicious attacks on the enemy's financial markets designed to disrupt trading and destroy the wealth of the people within those nations. It's either first strike disruption or second strike retaliation. On the defense, early detection of an attack and rapid response. You notice that attack is coming, so you can close the markets and keep the enemy from keeping their malicious traffic information attack going. And the big defense is like nuclear warfare. It's mutual assured financial destruction. If a country is worried about destroying a market in another country that they trade with, they're going to be less likely to completely destroy that market. Another aspect of information warfare is currency warfare. Currency warfare is the manipulation of a nation's currency to make it more competitive in the market and to gain advantages in trade aspects. Harry Dexter White, who was a assistant Treasury Secretary under President Truman, said that currency warfare is the most destructive form of economic warfare. Should also mention that he, along with John Maynard Keynes, helped co-found the IMF. And White was also someone who would fit in well in today's political environment because right before his death, he was believed to be a Soviet spy. The final aspect of Rickard's information warfare is technology warfare. This is what we most align when it comes to the idea of information warfare. We think of technology warfare, communication warfare, cyber security, hacking. James Comey, the current FBI director, stated in 2014, much before he was well known for other hacking aspects in the news, that there are two kinds of big companies in the United States. There are those who have been hacked by the Chinese and those who don't know they've been hacked by the Chinese. A good example of what Rickards means by information warfare would be the Sony Pictures hack. This was well documented and well reported back in 2014. In November of 2014, a group calling themselves the Guardians of Peace leaked out information that they acquired by hacking the Sony Pictures informational infrastructure. The initial investigation led people to believe that this was part of an attack by North Korea and was done to prevent the upcoming movie, The Interview. Actually, it's still rather unknown who the actual hackers are, other than the Guardians of Peace. If they were state-sponsored by North Korea or some other entity, it's still unknown. What is known, it was a malicious attack done through information technology. How much did it end up costing Sony? Well, the number is still unknown since there are some court cases that have yet to be settled. But we did know that Sony claimed a loss of $15 million in the third quarter. Then the first quarter, they had to upgrade their technology, $35 million. And the final costs are estimated to be over $100 million.
Hello, my name is Taylor Petermann, and I will be narrating Chapter 3, The Ruin of Markets. With a little bit about markets and kind of give a brief overview. Markets are places where buyers and sellers can meet, and this is the current problems with our market today, especially in the US, is that another very interesting topic to think about when we think about another big problem in our current market today is another big problem in our current market. Last big problems with our current markets that I want to touch on is the clouded crystal ball effect.
Hi, my name is Tyler Schnebel, and I will be going over Chapter 4, China's New Financial Warlords. Looking at China today, a lot of people see it as a major power, and to attribute to that is because it is the longest continuous civilization. Although it experienced many changes in power throughout the course of history, it maintained its unity, losing and gaining certain regions, but primarily each region still considered itself part of China due to its culture. There was really no balance in the rule in early China. It went through many different dynasties and had very many different leaders. Uh, in the early 1900s, there was a lot of revolution in China, leading up to the First and Second World War. It was centrally governed only in name, so still meaning that many of the regions still considered themselves part of China, even though it was not a whole country at the time. Power was fought over by 27 different cliques, led by these warlords, all fighting to gain power, working together, breaking off from one another, all just trying to become the main power to control all of China. It wasn't until 1928 that Chiang Kai-shek and the National Revolutionary Army defeated the cliques to establish a central power. Uh, During this time, the Communist Party was driven out of China, but it did survive, and it eventually rose to power post World War II. Prior to 1979, during the communist rule in China, the economy was operated on the basis of an iron rice bowl principle. Times were very difficult. There were no high growth jobs or opportunities available. Forced labor, collective farming, and central planning were all common. The whole principle was based on stability. There was no growth, it was merely just an afterthought. Uh, in, in 1979, this philosophy was replaced with a growth driven economy. This is not necessarily an improvement, although food and necessities were guaranteed. The Communist Party still had a role, and by no means was this operating a free market. Following World War II, in 1949, during the communist takeover of China, all the businesses in China were owned and operated by the state. Uh, this continued for the next 30 years until the economic reform in 1979. Afterwards, the SOEs, or state owned enterprises, took one of three paths. Some were closed, others were merged into larger SOEs, and certain SOEs were privatized and became listed companies. The remaining SOEs grew powerful and received the designation of national champions in particular sectors. One of the largest SOEs is China State Shipbuilding Corporation, and the China Petrochemical Corporation. These just make up a few of the 10 most profitable SOEs in China, which remarkably produce over 50 billion in net profits in 2010. This sounds great, but however, it's not great for China. Uh, this chapter looks at the warlords of China historically in the beginning, but now the newer financial warlords who act in their own self-interest rather than China, and they operate under many unethical practices such as bribery, corruption, and coercion. And Rickards even describes them as a cancer on the Chinese growth model in the book. During all these closings, mergers, and privatizations of these SOEs, many of these financial warlords received private deals on whatever they were working on to get the SOEs to merge, or if they were able to get them to become privatized. And this is not what China needed after going through the whole communist era. Of course, communism is the principle that everyone is equal, everyone is getting the same for doing the same job. There's really no class system. But what's happening now is these financial warlords and communist leaders were basically taking the biggest chunk of the pie that they could and not sharing the wealth at all, which staggered the class system and prevented growth in China going forward. As a result of what they were doing, they were spending too much money within China on the wrong things. An example is the unused infrastructure. So much money was being put into building up all of these cities when no one could afford to live there. Empty buildings, unused roadways. It was almost like they were preparing for a large growth that they weren't focusing on. They were spending a lot of money on public transportation, roads, buildings, malls, and there was no one who could afford to use any of these things. Post Iron Rice Bowl, the China miracle happened. So, as I had mentioned that it was not a free market and there was no relaxation of the Communist Party, there was enough room for local managers and foreign buyers to utilize cheap labor and imported ideas in order to create comparative advantages in a wide range of tradable manufactured goods. Basically, what that means is what we see happen with companies like Apple. It's much cheaper for them to produce an iPhone 6 in China than it would be for them to produce it in America. The labor was cheap. It was, enough labor there that they wouldn't have to teach people that many things. It was a simple task, and it really gave companies like that a great advantage. But this led to China's GDP increasing an insane amount. From 1979 to 1990, it rose from $263 billion to $404 billion a year. And then again, from 2000 to 2011, it rose 1.2 trillion to 7.2 trillion just in 11 years. So over the 30-year span, that is a 27-fold increase. Today, China, their GDP or economic output is about half the size of the U.S. But this Chinese miracle that happened makes many, maybe not so experts, but people in the industry assume that China will eventually pass the United States in total output, and that it will resume its role in global power as number one. Others say that this likely won't happen. If you look at the factors, everything involved, that if this truly were to happen, then this growth should have happened decades sooner. And they scrutinize China's ability to grow uh, at the pace that they have been, just based on historical facts. So, like I mentioned on the last slide, economic output in China is about half the size it is in the United States. Um, Also mentioned that growth was ridiculously fast, but it did take time to happen based on the political policies, the Communist Party. This is something that should have happened very early on in the 1900s. But as the saying goes, they were just late to the dance. Uh, the policies that were in place didn't allow them to utilize all the resources that they had, one of those being a large labor force. And because of the policies in place, it was hard for them to grow because labor requires housing, transportation, and that's something that they didn't necessarily get early on with the Communist Party. Later on, there was a lot of overspending on these things, but there was no compensation to the working class, so there was no one to use them, and there was no reason to use them. Lately, growth is decelerating to sustainable levels. Nothing as insane as the 27-fold increase. It is something that they're going to be able to sustain over the coming years. There are large businesses in China. There are a lot of Western companies there. The downside for China now is that they're not very innovative. You look and see that great tech companies like Apple have a lot of business in China, but these are very low-paying jobs. These are factory jobs. It's not something that is producing new technology. And that being said, China is not great at creating new content or technology, but they are great at stealing it. You see a lot of products from China that are quote unquote ripoffs of other products. It's a stigma that's now associated with them. So in China, the banking industry is extremely corrupt, is what it would seem after reading through this chapter. Hence the term shadow finance and shadow banks. The banks look as if they're doing extremely well, but in reality, there's a lot of bad assets and hidden liabilities, and this just causes basically a can of worms to be opened for the everyday people. So in China, there really is no social security, there isn't great health insurance, and there isn't great retirement plans in place. Now, Chinese people are very great at saving their money because of these things. When traditionally elderly couples would rely on their large families and the cultural respect for elders, that they would be taken care of until they passed. But now people are realizing that they're on their own. China has a one-child policy in place, and this has basically just eroded all of the large families in the past, especially with many different generations living in the same household. Used to be very common. So they're very good at saving, but much like the rest of the world, interest rates on a savings account are extremely low, and working an everyday job for low wages and just saving your money in this account is not going to get you anywhere. You're not going to have enough money to live off of for the rest of your life. One of the more popular strategies to save up enough money for your retirement is investing in these wealth management products, which is basically a pool or fund in which investors buy small units. The proceeds are invested in high yielding assets, and these assets consist of mortgages, properties, and corporate debt. So there is also, these resemble the CDOs and CLOs that basically almost caused the Western economy to crumble in 2008 during the housing market crash. And in China, these are unregulated, even though the regulation really didn't do anything at all for us here in America. But that was all because of greed. So with these WMPs, Chinese people see these as a way that they can save and earn a lot of money towards their retirement. And it's very promising. They look and see that the bank sponsors these WMPs, and the related assets and liabilities do not even appear on the bank balance sheets. So the banks look to be doing amazingly well. It allows the banks to claim that they're healthy, and they're basically building an inverted pyramid of high risk debt. So the investors see the high yields offered by the WMPs, and they just want in, and they basically just assume that because it's being promoted by the bank, that the investment is going to be protected just like their deposits are protected with deposit insurance. But the high yield and principal protection is just an illusion. Now, all of the investments into these WMPs go directly into financing the same wasted infrastructure and property bubbles that the bank formerly financed before the credit tightening measures were put in place. So the cash flows of these projects were too small to meet obligations for WMP investors, and the maturities of the WMPs were often short term, while the projects that they were investing in were long term. So just a total mismatch here. And if we look to what happened in America in 2008, this was the same thing that caused Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers to fail. It's ridiculous that someone with access to world news could be replicating the same thing and not think that anything bad is going to happen. It's basically a giant Ponzi scheme, and eventually every Ponzi scheme comes to an end at one point or another. So certain people, basically the Chinese elites or upper class, understand that what's happening right now in their economy is not a good thing. And the government has stepped in to try to prevent anything from being accelerated. So basically, I mean, if you were wealthy and lived in China and saw what was happening and had an understanding of financial history in other parts of the world, you would want to get the heck out of there. There's a law in China that prohibits anyone from taking any more than $50,000 out of the country, and attempts to take it out illegally are becoming more and more common. Basically, it's people getting out while they still can, with what they have, still being worth what it should be. And basically, the government is just overreaching to prevent a financial disaster. But it's ignoring their own history and ignoring the recent history of what has happened in America. So, in conclusion to the whole warlord tie-in, before they had fought to gain control of the country, and now more or less kind of they fight to gain control of maybe not necessarily the economy, but as much money as they can get their hands on. And I really like Rickard's comparison right here, saying how they loot savings with one hand, basically stealing all the money that they can from the citizens in China, and as soon as they get their hands on it, they send it to another country where it will be safe. Australia, the U.S. A lot of people have tried to use a loophole where they can make a deal with casinos hey, I'm going to lose all this money in your casino. I'll pay you a portion. I'm really just trying to get money out of the country, because basically one of the only legal ways that a Chinese person can take more than $50,000 out of the country is to pay off debts. And they're not stupid. They're going to try any way they can to get this money out. But basically, China needs to take a look at its own history and just address itself. They need to implement some regulations. They need to do basically what the U.S. did whenever all these scandals came out in the accounting industry, finance industry, and a lot of people were put in jail. Something like this needs to happen, or it's not an argument that the bubble's going to burst at one point, and when it does, it's going to have an effect not only on China but the majority of the world. Just for a brief, quick conclusion to the first 4 chapters of this book, I think that Rickards does a good job at pointing out that the financial industry is really large, and that there's a lot of areas and places that unethical behavior can take place. He does a good job at pointing out that whenever people who are participating in this unethical, most times illegal behavior, when they're not caught, the results can be catastrophic for everyone. It can be a worldwide impact. So I think a lot of people look at it and see, people being arrested, people being reprimanded for what they've done, and think, how could they do this? They've hurt so many people, when in reality, it might be a blessing that only that small amount of people did get hurt, because the effects can be very great. Especially with this last chapter, I think it's important to point out that this happens everywhere. A lot of people in recent years focus and see that it's happened a lot on Wall Street, a lot of fraud, a lot of corruption, and think that it's greedy Americans, but we can see that this happens everywhere, all over the world. And my next point, that governments participate in this. Governments try to manipulate the market. They try to adjust prices and be competitive in markets, and it's for many different tactics. It's to get the GDP up. It's for warfare, for financial warfare. It's for many different reasons. And I think the overall takeaway on this is just that as an individual, you need to be cautious and just pay attention to the news, and make sure you're getting credible sources for everything. And not to put all your eggs in one basket, as a common term in finance. It's hard to predict the future. You can't do it, honestly, and it's smart to just make sure you're paying attention, and hope that the pieces that we put in place to prevent these collapses and these negative outcomes are going to do their jobs and ensure that something like this doesn't happen. Thank you.